Real ID has moved to the Senate floor, and there are a couple of variations on bills. But basically, the bill that seems to be, I think, moving, and I think it will continue to move, even though it's sort of stalled at the moment. The Real ID bills are about ensuring that Missouri citizens have a driver's license or some kind of identification that allows them to be able to get on airplanes. As of January of 2018, a Real ID will be required. People will need that to get on airplanes, to access military bases, and other government buildings where an identification is required. We are one of just a small number of states who have not complied with this federal mandate, and there are people here in Jefferson City, some of whom in the House and the Senate, I don't believe they're the majority of people, but some of whom are very concerned about providing the underlying documentation that's needed to fulfill the requirements for a Real ID, which includes Social Security number. The people who don't want to have to provide that underlying documentation are, according to this bill that's been filed and that is currently being talked about on the floor, will have an option to opt out of getting a Real ID, one that allows them to get on military bases or to get on airplanes. I think the option is an interesting compromise for allowing people to access a Real ID in the state of Missouri versus allowing people who are concerned about privacy to opt out of that. In the committee hearing where we talked about this, I asked the question about, well, if we have this two-tiered approach, isn't that going to cost the state of Missouri more? Actually, it was demonstrated to me that because the state of Missouri will not be required to keep records of underlying documentation for the people who choose not to get a Real ID, that the cost would be less. The concern that was brought to my attention since that time was when you have a two-tiered system, it's easy to inadvertently have things go awry. So that somebody who may go in to get a Real ID somebody makes an error along the way and ends up with a non-compliant form of identification and perhaps doesn't know until they go to get on a plane or arrive at a military base to see their son or daughter off before they're being deployed. So, we'll have to address some of those kinds of questions as this legislation moves forward. The people that I've spoken to directly or the ones that I've received emails from are saying we want to make sure that we can travel without any problem. I understand that we've gotten some people on the other side who are suggesting that we protect their privacy. Going forward, I'm going to ensure that my constituents who want to access a plane or a government building or a military base have their ID. Unless this rule changes at the federal level, I will be supporting some form of the Real ID bill should it move forward. Another hearing we've had this week is in committee around what is being called the bathroom bill. I'm not sure where it started, but a bill was filed that said transgender students, and this is in public K through 12 schools, transgender students need to access the bathroom that aligns with the sex that is on their birth certificate from the time that they were born. We had, I think, 3 people who testified in support of this bill in our hearing this week, and we had, I think it's fair to say, dozens who came to testify in opposition to this bathroom bill. Included in the testimony of transgender adults and parents of transgender students were several transgender students themselves. Young people, I think probably the earliest age of a child that came, well, actually it would be in elementary school. So several children who, in particular, I recall several children, young girls who you would see and you would never think anything but that those were young girls. One of whom actually broke down during her testimony and said, I'm a girl. I'm finally in a place in my school where everyone knows I'm a girl and treats me as such. Please don't force me to go to the bathroom in a boy's bathroom. Please don't pass this state legislation that makes me do that. We heard from 2 parents of different sets of twins who were born, I don't know that they were born identical, but they were born with the same genitalia that would indicate that they were of the same sex. But as they became a little older, it was clear, at least one of the sets of twins that was there, one of the girls identified only as a boy, and if you saw this young boy, you would say there was no question in your mind that that was a boy. So this is a contentious issue, again, even though an overwhelming number of people testified against this bill. But my belief is that the state hasn't in the past and doesn't need to interfere with what school districts' policies are, and that they work out with their locally elected officials and with the families and the children who go to school there. What we want want at the end of the day is that all kids feel safe and secure in their schools, and the schools will come up with policies, hopefully working with the families of the transgender students and the other families, the 99%, if you will, of families whose children are not transgender, to come up with policies that support all children being safe in our schools. So we'll see if this bill moves to the floor. I heard that the Senate Pro Tem believes that this is an issue also that should be left to local school districts. So I was encouraged to hear him say that. This week, we also passed on the floor a prescription drug monitoring program bill. This is not the bill that I have filed. Senator Schatz and I have filed the same or very similar bills in the Senate, and that bill is moving forward on the calendar. They have been rolled together. This is the bill that was filed by Senator Schupp, who is very concerned about the privacy of people who are going to their doctors, even though people may come to the state of Missouri. We are the only state that does not have a prescription drug monitoring program. Those kinds of programs have now passed in the county of St. Louis and various other communities throughout the state because people believe it's so important. They believe that when people are shopping for illicit drugs, that Missouri is thrown out the welcome mat by not having a prescription drug monitoring program in place throughout the state. So when people are looking for illegal opioids, this may be where they come. This may be where they come to Dr. Shop in order to get prescriptions, where they can go into one doctor and claim to be having back pain, go into another doctor and claim to be having wrist pain, go into another doctor and claim to be having severe headaches, whatever would encourage a doctor to provide them with one of these opioid-based drugs. So prescription drug monitoring allows a doctor to access that information so that that doctor sees if someone is drug shopping by being aware of what other doctors have prescribed that same kind of drug recently to this particular patient, or to even take a look at what their patient might be taking that might be a contraindication for prescribing this kind of opioid drug. So in Senator Schaff's effort to protect patients' privacy, he does not give doctors that access immediately. They have to overcome some hurdles to access that information. I believe that our doctors who are sworn to keep the health and well-being of their patients first are not going to use this information for reasons other than what is prescribed in the legislation that I have filed and that Senator Schatz has filed. And I voted against Senator Schaff's legislation that did pass this week because I feel that Senator Schaff's legislation will undo the important work that has been done in St. Louis County and several other counties and communities around the state. So I voted no on that bill. It did pass, and we'll see if that particular version of our PDMP legislation is the one that moves forward. I wanted to talk this week about something that went on in the community next to mine, but the community where I grew up in University City. I think many people saw in the news and heard about the desecration of a Jewish cemetery. The count was as many as 200 tombstones that have been knocked over. You know, what a hateful thing to do, whether it was a Jewish cemetery or any other kind of cemetery, to disrespect our ancestors, the people that came before us. And I think that the fact that it was a Jewish cemetery, I can't help but feel that this was a targeted action against the Jewish people. I'm hopeful we find out differently when we see who perpetrated this horrific crime. But in an environment where so much of what we do is driven by fear and hatred and insecurity about who the other is, I think this is one example of how those kinds of fears play out and how hatred is exhibited in our communities. And it makes me step back and look at what we're doing as elected officials that promote those kinds of fears, that kind of hatred. I certainly don't believe my colleagues come here in an effort to create a community that encourages bigotry or prejudice or hatred. But sometimes I think out of fear, we pass legislation and we move forward bills that tend to give people the feeling that someone who is different from us or from someone who is them versus us is different, and different in a way that is negative. This cemetery was an example of that kind of bigotry playing out, and yet the people who came together from all different communities, including the Muslim community who helped out immediately to raise funds to help do what is needed to do to replace these tombstones, to help set them back up, and to help bring the cemetery back to a place where it's respectful of those who have been buried there. I commend and thank members of the Muslim community who joined in solidarity with members of the Jewish community to work to undo the hatred that was done that caused this kind of desecration. At the same time this week, I was told that a member of the Jewish community, who is also a young man who felt to be outside of things, who felt different, I guess. I can't pretend to know exactly what was in his head and heart, but some information he had relayed to me previously leads me to believe that some of this same kind of bigotry led him to the place where he completed suicide earlier this week. And learning about that right around the time I learned about the Jewish cemetery just resonated deeply with me about how our actions as elected officials or just as neighbors and friends in the community so strongly impact the people around us. This was also the week that mental health professionals and mental health organizations were visiting the Capitol. You may recall that a bill that we had worked on passed last year to allow professionals in our K through 12 schools, educators, and others in the schools to take a professional development course for credit that provided them with information about recognizing the signs and symptoms of suicide. Since that bill passed, we've been made aware that mental health professionals are not required to take that same course. And I think that when I learned that, it was certainly a surprise to me, as I think it is to many others when they hear that. So in light of what's gone on this week, and in light of what we've learned from Provident, a mental health professional facility that helps people with mental illness and certainly tries to help people before they get to a point where they try to take their own lives, and with the mental health professionals that were here this week, we're more encouraged than ever to try to make sure that people understand and can access information about the signs and symptoms of suicide in order to prevent those actions. And a reminder to all of us about the humanity of each of us and the fact that what we do matters to the people that are around us, and paying attention, and especially to elected leaders here in Jefferson City and in our communities. Let's make sure that we are diligent and vigilant in promoting policies that are inclusive and welcoming to people, even people who we perceive to be different than we are. Finally, I want to remind people that I'm part of a group that puts on a podcast each week, in addition to this one, a group of 5 female legislators from different areas of the state, all Democrats, but we have different views on legislation and what's going on here in Jefferson City. And the podcast can be heard through headsupmissouri.com and on iTunes. Thanks again for listening to the Capitol Report this week, and I welcome your input, your emails, your phone calls to the office.